The mind is inherently neutral. It isn't something that is separate from consciousness either. It exists at the personal and collective level. And mainly, it acts as a signaling board, reflecting back to you who you are in every moment. It's basically a dashboard. You don't ever quiet the mind, because the mind is fundamentally quiet. When someone experiences overthinking, it is not their mind that is the problem. The mind is only signaling a fragmentation that is happening at a much deeper level. In reality, disease, distress, and restlessness are symptoms of a much larger and more complex matter, deeply embedded in one's own psychophysical structure. And many people are ignorant to the intricacies and interconnectivity of these matters. But to simplify it, you could say that fragmentation persists from stagnation. And stagnation is simply the inability to move openly and freely. Innately, our natural default state is actually very pleasant. If the energy is flowing without hindrance, one really doesn't need to do much. But when there is barrier, when there is tension and rigidity, that's when disturbances become the norm. And that norm is the reality for most people, and most don't even realize it. But to someone who is alive, who is in movement and free flowing, he'll come to realize that society expresses itself in a very stagnant, repetitive, slow, and rigid way. Though logically, it would make sense to say that people get traumatized by what happens to them, and at some level, that is true. But the actual reality is that a large bulk of trauma has very little to do with what someone experiences from an external event. Rather, the key lies in the way in which their psychophysical body receives and processes that experience. If someone lacks movement in life, they're more likely to fall into a stagnant state. And that stagnation turns any experience, regardless of its nature, into something heavy and indigestible. And that might end up manifesting in fear, anxiety, or procrastination, or even inflammation. And people will go about trying to fix these things through healing or optimizing. But these methods are generally ineffective. And that's because you can't fix human stagnation directly, as you would do so with a machine. You have to approach the human body as a unit. And by addressing the core, by going back to the principle, the outer fluctuations and inflammations either become resolved or become less heavy. So, at a larger scale, the most effective way out of stagnation comes down to being and playing at the extreme end of movement and stillness. To fully unravel stagnation, one would have to either be in direct and intense movement or in direct and intense stillness. In any of these states, the chances of you even registering what happens around you is reduced massively. So it's not so much that you become healed, as much as that at a particular frequency, these occurrences are no longer found. Just like certain parasites die at a high temperature, in a heightened state, what you thought was a barrier suddenly turns to smoke, and what you thought was solid becomes nothing but a dream.